Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Let's begin today's session of the Hindu analysis with the first article that we have, talking about the Omicron wave in India and what should be the future plans from the side of the government to tackle this. The authors here who have written this article are health experts and have already written multiple articles on this topic in the Hindu newspaper in the past couple of months. The article here makes a point that the Omicron variant, which was discovered just about 3 months back, is now found in almost every country across the world, including India. It is 3 to 4 times more transmissible as compared to the Delta variant, that was a major variant existing before Omicron. However, across the world, if you look at the numbers carefully, you will observe that the number of deaths and hospitalizations are nowhere near the Delta variant, including in India. In fact, in many countries, including South Africa, where the variant was first discovered, the surge due to Omicron cases is declining. Usually, the timeline is that this variant is hitting a peak after 4 to 5 weeks, and after that, we see a decline in the number of cases. This can also be seen in big cities in India in the past week or so. However, the interesting point here is that a lot of rich nations, the nations that you would expect to do much better as compared to your own developing nations, such as UK, US, many European countries, are actually struggling to tackle the Omicron variant. For instance, in the US also, the average number of cases coming out almost every single day are somewhere between 7 to 8 lakh. This is much higher than the developing nations across the world, including India. Now, there can be multiple reasons for that. As per the author, one of the reasons that the developed nations are unable to tackle this issue properly is because they are focusing much more on the medicines and on the vaccines rather than enforcing appropriate COVID behavior. In nations such as the US, there is still a large number of people who are averse to having vaccine shots. There is still a considerable population who has had many misgivings about the vaccines, and the government is just not able to get through to them. The people are much more happier getting infected with COVID and getting into the hospitals because they trust their healthcare system more as compared to getting the vaccine. Thus, nations such as the US and other developed nations are not being able to impose appropriate COVID behavior. This is also because, to some extent, in these nations, people are much more aware and are much more concerned about their rights and their freedoms. Thus, they are living in a society that any mandate from the government, be it a mandate for their own good health, doesn't go well with them. So if the government mandates that you have to have vaccine for your own good, people start protesting that it is my right to choose whether or not I would like to have vaccine. There were some nations in Europe that did impose compulsory vaccinations if you had to go back on jobs, but nations such as the US were not able to do this, and that is why we still see a lot of cases of Omicron emerging in these nations, including the US. The other major point of discussion across the world during this Omicron wave was the necessity to have more tests or not. In fact, the same author had written an article in the Hindu newspaper a couple of weeks back when the government of India said that there is no need for everyone to get tested. This author, in fact, had made this point earlier as well, that the government strategy in India to put a limit on the number of tests and not test unlimited number of people is actually a good strategy. And he makes the same point here as well. There won't be any positive outcome achieved by increasing the number of tests for Omicron variant or for coronavirus generally. We have seen in the past that imposing curfews, imposing lockdowns was not even able to control the Delta variant. And this Omicron is anyways much more transmissible as compared to a Delta variant. So there is no point of increasing number of tests because every test at the end of the day is a financial burden on the government and on the people's resources. The biggest example that we can see is from South Africa, the nation where the Omicron variant was first detected. In South Africa, fortunately, the wave of Omicron is almost over. During this Omicron variant, South Africa imposed minimal restrictions. They just revised their isolation and quarantine requirements. They did not do any excessive tests. In fact, they even closed the schools for just a few days before opening them up once again. The one thing that South Africa did do, however, was they used the booster shot strategy. But this is where South Africa was slightly different as compared to India. The reason being, South Africa mainly used the Johnson & Johnson vaccine earlier, which was anyways a one-shot vaccine. So most of the South African population only had one shot vaccine, and the efficacy of that vaccine was anyways much lower than the Covishield and Covaxin that we have had. So after their booster shot, most of the South African population now have a total of two shots of vaccine, and that has worked immensely well for them. India also, just like South Africa, can learn from their examples. The author says that if you look at the population, the income levels, and the demographic dividend that India has, we are much closer to South Africa as compared to other European nations. Thus, if we must learn from any other nation, it has to be South Africa, and we can follow their strategies, which have been extremely helpful in curbing this rise of the Omicron variant. Now, what exactly are those lessons that we can learn? First, the test positivity rates are not the best indicators right now when it comes to decision making from the government. Rather than that, the government must focus on the hospital bed occupancy, that is, keeping an eye on how many hospital beds are occupied at any point of time. Are they increasing as compared to the national average, or what are they as compared to the second or the first wave? Second, keep an eye on the ICU admissions. Are they increasing at a rapid pace or not? Thirdly, make a concrete treatment plan and transmit it to almost every hospital that is dealing with the COVID cases. Now, as per the authors, in the first two waves of the coronavirus crisis, although we lost lakhs of people that we should not have, but it did give us a lot of information about how to deal with such pandemic and such crisis later on. Thus, learning from the past mistakes that we have done, there should be a proper guideline and testing criteria that should be made and transmitted to every particular hospital, so that whenever we have a COVID case being admitted in any hospital, the hospital must know what is the first step, the second step, the third step, etc. And all those guidelines must be followed rigorously by every single hospital. So the focus of the government must shift from testing people to ensuring that everyone receives an apt treatment which has been made by experts. The other suggestion that the authors have is that the government must not try and curtail economic activities but should focus on ensuring that there is COVID appropriate behavior seen across the country. We must make sure that all our steps are based on credible information and are science based, and we must make ourselves ready since this is not the final variant of COVID that we are anyway seeing in our lifetime. The other lessons for the future, as per the author, include an increased focus on ventilation, especially about the indoor spaces which are built in the government premises or even in the private sector, an increased focus on improving our health communication and the primary healthcare sector, which is the first place where most of the people would go to get a health checkup themselves. The government must also ensure that they bring in public subsidies for free mass distribution and even incentivize people that adhere to COVID apt behavior in the coming times. One other sector that has been at the center of debate, especially in the past couple of months, is the schools across the country. Most of the experts in the education sector have been of the view that we should have never closed down the schools so early. Schools, as per all the studies available throughout the world, should have been the last places to close down and the first places to open. There have been multiple studies suggesting that the children, especially in the primary and at the pre-primary stage, are at the lowest risk of catching this infection, and they're missing out on the years that are the formative stages of their lifetime. Thus, the policymakers must ensure that they take quick decisions about the schools reopening across the country and make sure that in case of the future waves, the schools are the last places to be closed down. Now, let's take a look at how did South Africa fare with the Omicron variant and what lessons exactly can we learn from South Africa. Now, as you would know by now, South Africa was the first place where the Omicron variant was detected. And thus, it gives us a good beginning point to learn more about the Omicron variant. From South Africa, we learned that the Omicron variant is not as deadly as compared to Delta, but is certainly much more transmissible as compared to the Delta variant. The Omicron variant in South Africa has proven to result in much lesser hospitalizations and much lesser expenses when it comes to medicines. That is mainly because of the high vaccine coverage in South Africa. In fact, during the Omicron surge, the political parties kept on campaigning for the local election in South Africa, and the local government elections went on successfully without any panic being created amongst the people in South Africa, which shows that the strategy of lockdown might not be the most effective one to control the Omicron variant because it would anyways be transmitted from one person to the other. So the focus must be on vaccine, the focus must be on ensuring that people change their behavior rather than locking them indoors. Since South Africa brought this variant to the global attention, ideally, it deserved to be appreciated. However, the contrary happened with South Africa. The nation received a raw deal from Europe, and many European nations, including UK, halted their flights to South Africa, leading to a great economic loss to the nation. South Africa, anyways, depends a lot on its tourism activities to earn foreign exchange, and that is why the past few months for South Africa have been extremely hard, considering that the number of tourist inflow to the country has reduced considerably. Thus, South Africa's capability to conduct more tests on the Omicron variant has been dented because its foreign exchange earning has been dented because of these restrictions imposed by the other nations. This is also an interesting graph published by the Financial Times about the Omicron variant as compared to the earlier variants in South Africa. As you can see, the first graph shows that the number of cases coming up due to the Omicron wave are almost the same as Delta. However, when it comes to hospital admissions, deaths, or excess deaths, you will see that the Omicron variant fares much better as compared to any other variant. The number of deaths that have been seen due to Omicron are much lesser as compared to the first wave, the beta wave, or the Delta wave. And the same is the case with hospital admissions in South Africa. And thus, India must also learn from this, and rather than imposing lockdowns or weekend curfews since they have not worked in the past, we must focus on ensuring that our vaccine coverage reaches the maximum possible limit. The next article that we have here talks about the increasing fiscal deficit in India and how should the government's upcoming budget react to it. The authors here make a point that there is an expectation around the world that the US Federal Reserve will increase its interest rate. Now, in very simple terms, when the US Federal Reserve increases its interest rate, that means that the American capital across the world gets out from the other markets, and these capitals go back to the US because they think that they will now get a better rate of return in the US itself. So when the US Federal Reserve increases its rates, the expectation is that the investors from the US who would have invested in India, they will take out the money and they will invest it in the US to earn good returns. As a result of this, there is pressure on the RBI also to hike the interest rate in India so that the capital does not outflow and that investment remains in India for a longer period of time. And this is not just the RBI. In fact, if you see, central banks across the world have started to increase their interest rates, expecting that the US capital outflow would take place in the country if their interest rates are not favorable enough. We have also seen that there are inflationary pressures in India, with the wholesale price index being at an all-time high of over 14% and even the CPI nudging the self-imposed limit of 6%. Just a few days back, we did discuss about the issue of inflation in the country and how can we tackle that. As per the author, the experts believe that this inflation that we are seeing in the market will not be a permanent feature. In fact, inflation right now is transitionary and it is taking place because of supply chain issues that we have seen due to lockdowns in different parts of the country. There is also volatility in the food and energy prices, further adding to the inflation, which will settle down in the coming months as per the author. The RBI, in a latest report, revealed that there is a possibility of the gross NPA of the banks becoming even worse. For example, in September 2021, the gross NPA was 6.9%, and the RBI expects the same number in September 2022 to become 9.5%, which is a worrying sign for the entire economy, meaning that the RBI thinks that the people who are taking money from the banks might not be able to return it in the coming year. Another issue right now that the government is facing is the increasing bond yield. Now, if you have to understand bond yields, these are kind of interest rates that the government offers on government securities. So, for example, the government of India needs some money. So, they will go to the market, ask the people to buy government securities or bonds. You give the government rupees 100 and the government says that I'm giving you an interest of, let's say, 7%. So after 1 year, I will return 107 rupees to you. In this case, the bond yield will be 7%. Now, if the government thinks that to attract more money from the people, they would have to offer higher rate of interest, let's say 10%, and the government promises that in return for 100 rupees, I will give you 110, then obviously more people would like to buy government bonds and government will get more money. But the cost of taking money in this case from the market for the government is increasing. So higher bond yield means higher cost of borrowing for the government, and thus government's fiscal deficit will keep on increasing. Now, at the time when the budget is just a few days away, there is a very important decision that the government has to make. Number one, should the government reduce its fiscal deficit? Fiscal deficit in simple terms means that the government is spending more than it is earning. So, how is it getting the money? It is borrowing the money from the market. So, ideally, as per government's own limit, the fiscal deficit should be brought down to 3% at least. Right now, it is at 9.5%. The other option that the government has is reduce the spending so that the fiscal deficit comes down. But reducing the spending means reducing its expenditure on building infrastructure and thus a loss of jobs. So these are the two options for the government. Either spend more money and increase the fiscal deficit, borrow more money from the market, or to reduce the fiscal deficit, should the government stop its expenditure. The authors are of the view that right now we are in a situation that the government must not try and control the fiscal deficit. If it is increasing, let it increase. The government must right now focus on spending more money, building more capital so that more jobs can enter the market. That expenditure from the government, as per the authors, must come in the field of health and in the field of infrastructure, because number one, health is right now the most important requirement for the country's welfare in the long run, and secondly, building of infrastructure is the shortest way possible to increase the number of jobs in the country. The government must focus on addressing the issues of unemployment, ensuring food security, and designing gender budgeting in the energy infrastructure. Thus, for some years now, let's put the target of fiscal deficit behind ourselves and focus on increasing our capital expenditure, because that is what in the long run will increase the tax bracket of the government and bring much more employment. Now, although I'm sure most of you are well aware of how the concept of fiscal deficit works, let me just give you a brief revision about fiscal deficit. In simple terms, fiscal deficit means when the government is spending more than what the government is earning. Means whatever the government is earning through taxes, whatever the government is earning from other income such as the RBI dividends, such as the companies that work for the government, and you compare that with the spending of the government. That is what fiscal deficit is. It indicates towards a shortfall in the government's income. It is calculated as a percentage of the GDP. So by formula, fiscal deficit would be total expenditure of the government minus the income of the. Now the expenditure that the government makes can be of two types. Number one, to build infrastructure such as railways, bridges, flyovers. That is a good kind of infrastructure. But the second expenditure can be because the government has to pay salary, has to pay pensions of a lot of people. That is not adding to the development of the country. So that kind of expenditure has to be reduced. Ideally, the government should aim for a low fiscal deficit because you should spend only as much money as you are able to earn. But in some cases, high fiscal deficit can also be good for the economy. But only then when the excess money that we are spending is for the creation of assets such as highways, roads, airports, etc. So that in the long run, it would improve our economic growth and it would bring much more employment to the people. So high fiscal deficit can be justified only for such scenarios. As I said, in the FRBM Act of 2003, the central government was given a target to limit the fiscal deficit up to 3% of the GDP by 31st March 2021. Obviously, the target has not been met due to the COVID pandemic. And anyways, even before the pandemic, the government was not in line to meet this target. In fact, the N.K. Singh committee that was set up in 2016 recommended that the government should target fiscal deficit of 3% by 2020 and then bring it down to 2.5% in 2023. The current situation, as we mentioned in the earlier slide, is that our fiscal deficit right now is at 9.5% of the GDP. And as per the authors, the government should not be in a hurry to bring it down because it will impact the employment scenario in the country. The next article here is written by a professor at IIT Bombay who makes a point that the government's decision to close down schools in the pandemic and not open them up properly is one of the worst decisions taken by the government and has no scientific basis at all. As per the author, the reason why the schools were closed is because the politicians thought that this is the easiest way to show the public that they are actually doing something to contain COVID 19. At the time when the schools were closed, there were no studies indicating that the students are at a danger of contracting COVID. And even right now, when a lot of studies have indicated that there's a very low chance of any school becoming a COVID infection hotspot, the decision of opening up the schools has not been taken in many parts of the country. We have continuously ignored the experts who have advised us against the closing down of the schools. If we look around us, we would find that most nations across the world, including the example of South Africa that we just took, have kept their schools open while prioritizing the well being of the children. In fact, international studies have suggested that the risk of COVID 19 for those who are under 25 is much lower as compared to even being involved in traffic accidents. So, as long as you're allowing people under the age of 25 to go out on the roads, they are at a much greater risk as compared to allowing them to attend schools and colleges. In fact, a study done in Spain reveals that for schools, the R value, that is the rate of spreading of virus, is much lower and it is even lower in pre-primary children. That is why in India, the decision to shut down the Anganwadis and the primary schools is extremely unscientific. Let's take an example of Sweden. Sweden, in fact, never closed its schools for kids under the age of 16 years because it depended on scientific evidence that there is no extra risk for teachers also as compared to others. The simple question that we should ask is, if we are not closing down the banks, we are not closing down the markets, we are not closing down railways, buses or airports, then why exactly are we closing down the schools? How is it that the schools are at a higher probability of becoming a COVID 19 hotspot as compared to markets where people don't have any discipline and it's extremely difficult to keep an eye on these open places? Now, while the government and other experts might point out that we have taken enough initiatives in the field of online education to work as a replacement to the schools and colleges, but the fact remains that online education can't be a possible replacement, especially in primary and pre-primary classes, since the kids at that age require human interaction. In fact, at that age group, the knowledge that they are getting from books is secondary as compared to the knowledge that they get from human to human interaction, be it with their peers or with the teacher themselves. There are surveys conducted across the world that have shown that the reading and writing levels of kids across the world have declined, with nearly half of them unable to read more than a few words. In fact, UK has reported increase in cases of mental health issues amongst the kids ever since the schools have been closed down. In America, the American Academy of Pediatrics has called mental health crisis among children a national emergency. And still, this issue has never been at the center of national debate in India, which has the largest number of children across the world. Closing down of schools in India has not just impacted their learning levels. Ever since the schools have shut down, there are no provisions of midday meals, and thus malnutrition has become a major problem. The number of children who are involved in child labor has been on an increase in the past couple of years. All that is linked because of the schools being closed down. We have to understand the fact that ever since the midday meal scheme was introduced, the enrollment in the schools across the country went up considerably. And that is what we are seeing right now. The argument that children without vaccines are at risk is also invalid, since the schools were open in several other nations before even the adults got vaccinated. And there were no emergency cases even in those nations. Many people have been suggesting that the government should first approve emergency authorization of vaccines for the kids before opening up of the schools. But we must realize that the concept of emergency use authorization of vaccines will only arise when the children are at an emergency of COVID 19, which we have not seen. Fortunately, in any of the waves, children have been the least impacted of all the population that we have seen across the country. And that is why there is no evidence to suggest that they require vaccine right now before they enter the school. Even the government's nod for vaccinating children from the age group of 15 to 18 is not based on scientific evidence. Education is a constitutional right, and by schooling closed for such a long time, we are violating the rights of the children. And that is why this topic needs to be at the center of national debate in this election season. Now, as I mentioned multiple times, this crisis of education is not indigenous to India. It is seen in most of the developing nations across the world and in some of the developed nations as well. Recently, a report published by UNESCO, UNICEF, and the World Bank named State of Global Education Crisis says that today's generation of students is at a risk of losing 14% of today's global GDP because of the school closures and the economic shocks. The study conducted has taken evidence from Brazil, rural parts of India, rural parts of Pakistan, South Africa, Mexico, etc. And all of them indicate towards a substantial loss in maths and reading of children across all the age groups. The report also suggested certain actions that can be taken in these nations. There's a three-step process that the reports have pointed towards. The first, consolidating the curriculum. It will help the teachers to prioritize the essential material to the students who have missed out on the school learning for quite a while. The content usually is segregated as per the grade level, and we need to change that to ensure that the students are aligned towards their learning levels. For example, in Tanzania, in 2015, the curriculum for grades 1 and 2 was consolidated, reducing the number of subjects that were taught and increasing the time on subjects where more foundational numeracy and literacy was required. The second step can be extending the instructional time. In Mexico, for instance, the Ministry of Public Education announced that we are planning to extend the academic year to help the recovery of students who have lost out on their education during the school closure. In Madagascar also, the government has scaled up existing 2-month summer catch-up program for the students, especially for those who have left the school system during the pandemic. The third suggestion given here is improving the efficiency of learning. For instance, in Kenya, teachers are using specially made lesson plans to be much more effective, considering on the learning loss that the students have faced in the past few months. The report in the end also emphasizes on the need for having adequate funding because across the world, the stimulus packages that have been announced focus on unemployment, health, and other things. But if you look at the global stimulus packages that have been allocated, less than 3% of that money has been focused on education and on the training sector. Thus, much more funding will be needed in the coming years if we have to bridge the learning gap that we have seen in the developing nations across the world. The next article that we have talks about the requirement to have a national vision for a nation like India. The author here compares India with China, saying that while China has made a policy of announcing grand plans and achieving them within the self-imposed deadlines, India, on the other hand, irrespective of whichever government is in power, has seen a tendency of announcing grand things but then under-delivering on almost all the promises. The author says that in 2015, China released a Made in China 2025 document, saying that in the next 10 years, we will focus on 10 key high-tech industries, reduce our dependence on foreign tech, and we will become at least 70% self-sufficient by 2025. Such a wide-scale document that covers basic details and also gives a plan of the future is not really found in India as per the author. In fact, China also gave a white paper in the field of defense in 2019, saying that by 2035, our armed forces would complete the modernization of national defense and military. Thus, China has had a policy of introducing white papers and vision documents for every single sector every 10 to 15 years. India, on the other hand, has been focusing on piecemeal announcements. For example, today the government might come and announce that we will try and reduce our dependence on defense imports and we'll focus on making much more arms and ammunition in India. 10 days later, we might have the government announcing that we'll now focus on solar energy. 20 days later, we might have a government announcement saying that from now onwards, we'll focus on building world class education institutions. But the problem is, we don't have a holistic document that takes into consideration what picture do we see of our own country by 2050, so that we know where are we working towards. There is an absence of vision documents that the governments have overlooked over the past few decades. And even the announcements that the governments have made in the past have not been fulfilled. For example, in 2018, India announced that we will be sending astronauts to space by 2022. However, since then we have only carried out 2 space launches in 2021, while China, on the other hand, set a world record of 47 space launches in the same time period. And the reason for that is, as I said earlier, Indian governments have been following a tendency of announcing the program in a grand manner first, but then under delivering on most of those programs. Some of the examples that first come to our mind is the announcement of making India a $5 trillion economy very soon, announcement of making India a manufacturing hub, bringing in companies from China towards India. All of these have remained announcements on paper without them getting translated on ground. For example, for all the talks of boycotting Chinese goods and Chinese services, right now India China trade is at an all time high. And not just the India China trade. In fact, our trade deficit towards China also is at an all time high, despite all the animosities that we have had with China. Thus, rather than following our vision or policy or announcements that we make, our actions don't seem to be in line with that. That is what the author is trying to point out. The author also says that in an era where international cooperation is the way to go forward, our focus on Atmanirbhar project is not very feasible. Although there have been good advancements made in the field of drone and other unmanned aerial vehicle devices, but to assume that all the best technology can be indigenous is not the way forward for India. And thus, we must be open to cooperation from across the world and forging as many partnerships as possible. Another example of under delivering is in the field of vaccines. India is a self proclaimed world vaccine capital. But when it comes to delivering of those vaccines, we could not fulfill even the orders that were already paid to us. Most of the neighbors in South and Southeast Asia were extremely disappointed when India was unable to deliver the vaccine orders because we promised more and we delivered less. The other example of India not planning for the long run can be seen in the field of defense as well. Almost after every unfortunate attack, be it the Kargil war, be it the Uri attack, be it Pulwama, we have seen emergency purchases being made of arms and ammunition by the government of India. Thus, there is no long-term vision of where do we want to see our military after 10, 15 or 20 years. Rather than that, it is seen that random orders are placed depending on which government comes to power and what has happened in the nation in the past couple of years. The author here, to end the article, says that a national vision document should be drafted, keeping 3 key things in mind. Number 1, there should be adequate time period given to draft it. Just because there is a need to have a vision document doesn't mean that we need it right now or just in the next couple of months. The experts should be given adequate time period to look at all the sectors of India and then draft such a document. Secondly, the vision should be put through economic and technological analysis to ensure that it is actually realistic in nature rather than making tall promises. And third, the implementation of such a draft should be done by a body of experts that has the confidence of the political class. We do not want a situation in which a draft document is created and when the experts are trying to implement it and the government changes after 5 years, we don't want a new government to come in and stop that in between. So there should be a consensus by every political party and then a draft document should be implemented by the experts. This is what the author says. Now, although the entire article says that India has never had such a vision document and we have never delivered on those documents in the past as well, I would like to differ and give a counterpoint of view here about 2 things. One, comparing India with China in such a case does not really make sense since we need to understand that India is a democracy and China is not. In a democracy, when the government has to go back to the people and ask for votes every 5 years, Even the government's approach is focused on what exactly can be achieved in the next 5 years. For a government in power, they are much more focused on what can be achieved by the time that I go to the voters to ask for votes again, rather than telling the voters that my policy will give you results in the next 30 years. That is how every democracy works, and that is why you can't really compare India with China. Not saying that it's an adequate policy, but that is why our policy documents, even when they are made, cannot be very long. Secondly, it is not that India has never given such a document. I'll give you an example of Niti Aayog's strategy for New India at 75. That is, how should India look when it completes 75 years of independence? This document replaced the 5 year plans with an aim to achieve an economic growth of 9 to 10% and make India a $4 trillion economy by 2022-23. This is a long document talking about 41 areas, and each chapter includes objectives for 2022, the progress that has already been made, the binding constraints, and the way forward. It's an extremely extensive document prepared after consultation at center, state, and district levels. Now, again, I'm not saying that this document and whatever aim that it had has been achieved, but I'm giving you an example that it's not that we have never had such a document in the past. This document has 4 sections: drivers, infrastructure, inclusion, and governance. Let me give you one more example apart from this. Recently, Niti Aayog released a white paper. Now, white paper basically is a document containing a lot of information by usually a company or an NGO or the government that highlights a certain problem and the vision to achieve that or the vision to solve that in the near future. This white paper was called Vision 2035, Public Health Surveillance in India, which is envisaged to serve as a vision document to propel public health surveillance. Now, these are just a couple of examples from a lot of other documents that the governments have released in the past at various levels of state and the center. Not to say that all of them have been achieved, but it's good to have a contrary point of view as well as compared to what we are seeing here. Let me give you one more example to add here. When the author here says that the governments in India make grand promises but don't deliver, this is actually true in many cases. Let me give you an example. So, for instance, a few months back, the Delhi government announced that we will be inducting 190 more low floor CNG buses to ensure that the traffic situation becomes much better in Delhi. Now, there was a big headline about 190 new buses coming in, but the reality was that on the day that this headline was made, there were only 2 buses that were actually inducted. When asked to the government where are the rest of 188 buses, they said that they will be coming in the near future, week by week. So maybe next week we'll have 2 more buses, then again next week we'll have 2 or 3 more buses. But then why did you say we are inducting 190 buses? Because the government said that we do not want to make a headline every week. So we are telling you the complete number, but we'll be bringing in those buses in a segregated fashion. Now, you might say that the government is right in doing this, but in reality, this big announcement was very different from the reality. You cannot say that 190 buses are being inducted when only 2 are being inducted on ground. The next article that we have talks about the challenge of antimicrobial resistance as is seen in India and many other nations across the world. In simple terms, antimicrobial resistance means that if you eat an antibiotic now, it will not have an impact on a lot of bacteria and pathogens that are in your body because they are already used to that level of antibiotics. That is called antimicrobial resistance. Means the antibiotics available in the market will become ineffective on the pathogens such as bacteria, fungi, and viruses. They will become resistant to them. The number of new bacteria that are emerging are at a much faster pace as compared to the new antibiotics that are emerging. In fact, a latest report in the Lancet journal called the Global Research on Antimicrobial Resistance said that about 49.5 lakh deaths have been associated with bacterial antimicrobial resistance in 2019. Means in 2019, 49.5 lakh people died because the antibiotics that they consumed were not able to kill the bacteria in your body. In fact, antimicrobial resistance today is the leading cause of death globally, even higher as compared to HIV, AIDS, or malaria. Just in South Asia itself, over 3,89,000 people were killed because of antimicrobial resistance, because antibiotics, when it needed, could not give them the relief in 2019. The death rate due to this issue is the highest in Western Sub-Saharan Africa, which is one of the poorest regions in the entire world, and the lowest in Australia. This report in the Lancet also talks about the various kinds of diseases that you can have because of antimicrobial resistance. As per the report, common infections such as lower respiratory tract infections, bloodstream infections, etc., which used to be cured very easily earlier, are now actually killing thousands of people every year because the bacteria that cause them have become resistant to the treatment, and these antibiotics which are available are not able to cure them. Young children, in fact, are particularly affected. In 2019, 1 in 5 global deaths due to antimicrobial resistance was in children under the age of 5. Now, the problem can be easily understood if you look at how antibiotics have emerged in the past couple of decades or so. Between 1980 and 2000, 63 new antibiotics were approved. So, in the 20-year period, 63 new antibiotics came up. But between 2000 and 2018, in this 18-year period, only 15 additional antibiotics were improved. We right now have at least 5 such bacteria in the world against which we do not have any vaccine or any antibiotic available, which is a grave danger to the entire human population. Now, what are the suggestions? As per the article, we need to improve the access to vaccines, especially in lower developing areas. We need to have clean water and sanitation facilities expanded to all parts of the world. We need to ensure that antibiotics are consumed only and only when they are required. You should not be allowed to pop a pill whenever you want it. We should act as per the WHO's recommendations on the usage of antibiotics and increase funding to develop new antibiotics as soon as possible. Now, for a bit, let's focus on the antimicrobial resistance problem in India. There are various reasons why this problem is emerging in India and is ongoing at a fast pace. The first reason being the consumption of antibiotics in India. Now, the reality is that it is extremely easy in India to go and buy any medicine from any medical shop without even having to show any official prescription of the doctor. Even worse, in every single household, I'm sure you would have a medicine box where you would have medicines which were consumed by your parents, by your cousins when they fell ill, and without even asking the doctor, you pop in that pill thinking that you would also become better just by having that. We avoid going to a doctor's at any cost, which is kind of a habit in India. Now, this leads to consumption of antibiotics which your body does not require. Not just this, even for diseases which are not caused by bacteria, for example, viral fever, many people consume antibiotics thinking that they know better. The word antibiotics itself suggests that it is against bacteria and not against viruses and other pathogens. But in India, still, because of our habit of not going to doctors or not seeking medical help, we have a tendency to consume much more antibiotics as compared to how much it is needed by our body. Not just this, there are other activities also in India that lead to such problem, such as cultural activities like mass bathing in the rivers. Rivers anyways in India are not the cleanest. They have a lot of pollutants. They face a lot of issues such as the discharge from factories and pharmaceutical industries that have a lot of antibiotics and related material which harms your body immensely. The other way that you get antibiotics in your body when you don't want it is when you consume meat. A lot of meat in India, be it the chicken, be it other forms of meat, when they are grown for human consumption, are fed antibiotics so that they can grow at a faster pace and they can earn more money in the market. That is also a way in which your body gets unwanted antibiotics on a day-to-day basis. India right now is amongst the nations with the highest burden of bacterial infections. In fact, the National Health Policy 2017 specially highlights the problem of antimicrobial resistance in India and talks about effective actions to address this issue. Now, the government of India in the past few years has taken certain steps in this direction. For example, we have a red line campaign. Red line campaign means now it is mandatory that on the packaging of every antibiotic medicine, there would be a red line made on the strip. Means those medicines cannot be sold over the counter. It will only be sold to you by the chemist if you have a valid doctor prescription saying that you require the medicine in certain amount. Since 2014, the government has also introduced a separate Schedule H1 category of drugs which cannot be sold over the counter and can only be sold to those patients who have the doctor's prescription. The FSSAI, the same body that banned our beloved Maggie, has also banned the use of antibiotics and several other active substances in fisheries. The government has also capped the maximum limit of drugs that can be used for the growth promotion in meat and meat products. Thus, these are the steps that the government of India has taken in the past few years. But even today, you know that if you go and walk into any medical store, it's not very difficult for you to get any medicine that you require without even having to show that prescription. These are the articles we wanted to discuss from the Hindu newspaper today. Now, a couple of practice questions. Number one, list out the most probable reasons for increasing antimicrobial resistance in India. What initiatives have been taken to tackle this problem? Second, prolonged school closures due to pandemic have dented an already fragile education system in India. Comment. Both these questions have to be answered within 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.